And so I guess I really welcome the opportunity to come along, in that sometimes when you see media through the prism of social platforms or in a feed, it's hard to get an idea of exactly what's behind it. So to begin with, and it's something I know that most sessions have started with, an acknowledgement of country. It's, I guess as a sort of media brand, it's a very important part of our ethos and understanding to consider the work we do with First Nations people, particularly First Nations knowledge within research and academia. And there's some examples there of some of the stories that we've done on First Nations scholars. There's one example which was picked up, a scholar from Charles Sturt University, and then picked up by policymakers and government to inform a sort of development of a process and a policy. And that's a beautiful sweet spot for us. That's what we're kind of designed to do. It's media with a purpose to inform change and to do something about it. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, the Wurundjeri people. So this all started about just over 10 years ago in Melbourne. We're based up near the university in Parkville, and in most places where there's the conversation, we're on a campus or closely attached to a campus. And it's a very sort of Melbourne story in that there were two co-founders, and one of them, who was the editor, a really dynamic sort of driving force of the whole project, Andrew. He had been an editor of the Age newspaper and some big titles in the UK. He'd left the Age and was basically doing a piece of work for Melbourne Uni. So the Vice-Chancellor at Melbourne Uni, Glenn Davies at the time, said to Andrew, look, can you look at all our public engagement strategies and think about how the university's kind of getting their academics out into the public? And they had a paper called The Voice at that time, which was sort of like a thing that they used to do inside the Age. It was a bit of a sort of, summary of the types of stuff that was happening at the university. And so Andrew went around and spoke to a lot of academics, and they all sort of said the same thing, which was, look, we want to engage with the public. We'd like to do more media, but because of the situation with large mainstream media, when they send a reporter out, it used to be that they would send out a real specialist, a really experienced science editor who has done that round for years, or someone working in environmental health or foreign affairs or what have you, and they really know their area. So it was a very easy debate and discussion. They'd ask me the right questions, an article get written. I was really happy about it. But because of the destruction of the media model, which was really starting to bite sort of 10 years ago, most of the people who first got that first big round of redundancies in media, they were all the old people who were more expensive. And so they all got packages, and the people who came in to replace them were sort of generalists. No less awesome, but they were expected to learn, they had digital sort of skills, they had to file the stories, do the videos, run around, and they weren't just doing a science story, they were doing all sorts of stories, so they'd become real generalists. So on the one hand, media was sort of getting, if you like, shallower rather than sort of deeper, and there was just less of it, a lot more relying on cheap copy, a sort of opinion dressed up as fact, going to get columnists like celebrities or people who just wanted to sort of profile themselves. They'd get a column, off you go. So media's getting, let's say, worse and worse. And on the other hand, academics are sort of withdrawing. One conversation Andrew had with Peter Doherty, Doherty Institute, Nobel laureate, immunologist, very smart guy. Peter said, look, I get interviewed by someone now and I think, oh, how bad is this going to be? And who will I have to sort of ring the next day in terms of my colleagues to kind of unwind it all? And Peter said to Andrew, if you could sit next to me, you know how to write, I know what I'm talking about in terms of infectious disease, if we could just write it together, then that would be really good. And that's when Andrew thought, well, that's it. I mean, that's the idea. All you have to do is hire a whole lot of journalists, but have them doing a work of an editor and pair them up every day with an academic, and suddenly you've got this collaboration between journalism and academia that can come together to really unlock that sort of knowledge. So it was sort of bizarre. When I first heard the idea, I had another job and wasn't looking. So I was talking to Andrew about monetisation stuff. Someone connected me. And I was sort of blown away that no one had done it. It seems so simple. Oh, okay, so no one's done this in the world before in terms of media startups, and they hadn't. So, whoops, that's backwards. Basically, money was raised, a team full of editors were employed, and it operates exactly like any traditional newsroom. So every morning at 9 a.m, all the editors come in and they would have read all the media releases from various places, policy documents, listened to Fran on RN, looked on Twitter, read all the mainstream papers, just been clued in according to the round that they've been assigned to understand sort of what's in the news cycle, just like you would if you were producing radio or down at The Age or anywhere. And what they are then able to do is basically find the right expert at the right time to get an idea that will be the right sort of person for it. So they have to be available, they can only write in their area of expertise, and they'll commission something to do. So if something happened overnight, another sort of something connected to the coronavirus, for example, perhaps it's something to do with cruise ships and going crazy, stuck in a vessel for 12, how long is it going to be there? Like 2 weeks? Maybe they'll do something on, I don't know, claustrophobia. Perhaps not that quite trivial, but as an example. They would find a leading researcher to say, well, what are the health impacts on the body if you lock someone in a room for 2 weeks with no light? And that might be of interest to people who are rather stuck in there, but also just, provide some explanation about a current event that's in the news. And so that's the way that that's set up and works. So we operate as a non-profit. It was really important to set up the company like that. There are a lot of choices we could have made. The fact that we took money out of the equation, and there's no shareholders, there's no pathway to an exit, there's no venture capital kind of sitting there waiting to get realised, it keeps it very pure in terms of the supply chain. So academics write on this platform without any payment. And they do that because it's part of their sort of civil duty as public intellectuals, part of their roles as sort of academics connected to institutions. But they also do it because stuff happens after they publish, and you get a lot of other impacts that occur just because you're putting yourself out in the media. And I'll show you a couple of good examples. So we developed a charter as a non-profit charity, which is to really give experts a voice. So we're in service to basically unlocking knowledge that would otherwise be just tied up in the university sector, which we're all paying for through our taxpayer dollars, and delivering it back as a public benefit to the community at large. So it's also really important, and it's in our charter, to share best practice. So a researcher might write about something, and they might be out of the UK or Spain or wherever. If another academic's doing similar research, they might read it in this very accessible fashion and say, hey, do you want to work on something together? And that happens every day. And that's a very efficient and effective way of creating connections between expertise in terms of knowledge sharing and best practice. Similarly, quite often businesses will contact academics and go through a way in which they can, might be someone doing a sort of due diligence to put a wind farm down in Gippsland. And they'll contact someone who's written about something similar and go ahead and basically start a discussion about a potential collaboration and use that sort of best practice. Importantly, it should be fact-based and independent. It's interesting, academics can do this stuff because at their heart, academic freedom that isn't bound to their institution, it's a sort of core tenet. I don't know if there's any academics in the room or people sort of connected to the research world at all. No? A couple, yep, good. So, academics, if you know any in your life, quite often they're more, not always, but they're quite loyal to their practice, their work, and maybe their school or their faculty, perhaps less so than flying the flag for a particular university. They're a little bit like creatives in that way. They have an identity that's about the knowledge and the expertise beyond the brand. And so they're able to kind of think about things in a critical way that's quite sort of liberating. And the reason that this is sort of working, because there's no political angle, there's no ideological angle, there's no commercial angle. So we're really trying to sort of keep it to a point to say something's happened or there's new research. You write about it in a way, and we know mostly that that person hopefully is doing it from purely about sharing expertise and fact, not some other angle. So that's an important part of how it works. So the audience isn't just other academics. So it was always designed to be something for the public use. So basically, although they're our biggest group, there's still 82% are not academic. So other big chunks, teachers are about 14% of the audience. They use it in all sorts of different ways in classrooms, mainly sort of senior secondary, but sometimes primary. People who work in policy making and government often refer to it as part of their work, because if you're trying to brief a minister on something like an aspect of the Murray-Darling or something to do with street security or digital infrastructure in cities, you can find a contemporary article that's written by an expert that's independent, and you can print that out and say, there you go, Minister, I've got something for you. So they're using it in briefings a lot. People who work in healthcare and medical, clinicians, researchers, practitioners, general practice, it's good for them. Quite often we'll look at pharmaceutical or disease or sort of behavioural type stuff across the spectrum of health. And our health articles are by far the highest read, just because health articles affect all humans and they're of interest to everyone. And then other. So I guess if you look at the number of people in the room here at Pausefest, there's probably a pretty diverse group of people here in terms of the types of work you all do. You'd be somehow mostly in that other bracket. So interestingly, the way that our editors think about the work and the reason we need a big team of editors is because we're acting as a translation engine almost. We're taking what can be complicated things and simplifying them. And if you're coming from an academic sort of perspective, you actually learn how to make things really complicated because you're trying to establish your credentials, and you're talking mostly in peer-reviewed journals to other people who really know your area as well. This is a different way of writing. It's a way of saying, okay, what is the point of this? Who needs to know? What's the real impact? What's the takeaway? So there's some really good skills that academics learn by going through the process and working one-on-one with an editor on those sort of pieces. We decided to give all of it away for free. So no one gets paid, apart from obviously we pay our own staff. And any other media brand can take the conversation articles and publish them for free anywhere they like. And so about 2 years ago, we had a full-time ABC producer in our newsroom, embedded in the newsroom, and they were there for a whole year. They were basically there to kind of understand what we're putting out that day, jump on the phone to all their colleagues, especially radio, and say, hey, this is coming up, this is coming up, this is coming up, and just make sure that the ABC knew what we were putting out so they could do follow-up interviews and get ready for continuation of some of the ideas. And the ABC are our biggest republisher globally, actually. They probably take about 2 or 3 stories a day. But other big republishers, Salon take a lot, Washington Post probably take about 4 or 5 a week. And then within various niche markets, you'll often see stuff, say, on Mumbrella, which I guess you guys might be reading. And, if you're the publisher of a little shark blog in Western Australia, you'll just take an article on the shark stuff that we do. And it's funny, because if you're at a party and you're talking about the conversation, people will sort of see it through the prism of what they've got and say, I know what it is. It's the art stuff. It's the stuff that you do on the symphony orchestra, or it's the literary stuff. And if you go to a doctor's party, they're like, I love the conversation. I love the work you do on XX. So it is, I guess, like a lot of newspapers, it's really very broad perspective. We write on every topic and across every area of academia. So that's an important part of it. There's a republishing code, and other publisher just has to go to any article, click on republish, HTML with a little image pixel, which is the only tracking we sort of buy into, gets dropped in, it gets put into their website, and that counts it as a read, and it goes back into author dashboards and analytics that we give back to the academic authors and then aggregate up so that the institution can see every day how many reads are coming from various other brands. So it's just a powerful way for them to see that it's really getting out to a broad general public audience. So, such a good idea. Within 2 years, or even less, probably about 1.5 years, people in the UK were like, how do we get one of these? And so we created it a little bit like a franchise, where under license, using our own technology platform built in Melbourne on Ruby on Rails. It is a separate legal entity in each of these editions. They have their own boards, they've got to raise their own money. They pay a fee back to a business unit that is part of the Australian entity that helps them do sort of centralised stuff, but like 99% of that is really technology based, and workflow is built into the software. We've got about 7 different code bases that do a whole bunch of different things, which has allowed us to scale quite quickly and still retain compliance and consistency because it's one big website. I think if we were doing it through other sorts of, if we allowed people to have their own websites and their own brands, their own platforms, it would soon become quite a different thing. So part of the power has been to sort of actually have one platform all serviced by us. So UK launched, and they've got about 80 university members who pay an annual fee, and that we have here all of the universities in Australia, apart from one, so 39. And in countries that have public money going to universities, it works really well because they want to demonstrate engagement, they want to perform that act. In countries that are poor, it's very tough. A model like this is relying on philanthropy. In some countries where we haven't launched, where people would like us to, academics have a second job just to sort of get together enough income. So that's a bit of an interesting one for us in terms of it being somewhat a rich country project. But we do have philanthropic contributions from foundations in other countries to do specific projects. And we're read all over the world, translated into about 97 languages at last count. So there's now, the first other language was French in 2015, which was a big journey for us in terms of the code base and the publishing platform. Once we did it once, now it's quite easy. So Spain got up and running in 2008, and Indonesia a year before that. They publish in Bahasa, so that works well as well. The Africa project's interesting. That's almost all philanthropy, so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation fund that. They started in Joburg and now they're in 5 countries in Africa. And the idea of the model is to actually have local editors who are based there, who know enough about those academics and the news cycle and the local media that they can not be duped and really do high quality stuff that's right. I think if you were doing it all out of here and trying to connect to, say, audiences elsewhere, it would be very hard to make it work. So it's really that local perspective that we bring in terms of geographies. But as we sort of expand for the next 5 years, we're asking all sorts of questions about what should we do in Latin America, which may not have a strong university sector as some of these other countries. But obviously, there's a lot of people there who would like to have a media service like this. So there's 3 types of thing we do. This is one where it's new research that's tied to a journal article. It comes out, these guys have written something, a paper in Nature. Often there's sorts of collaborative journal articles. Now, if you read the journal article, it would be probably great, but quite dense, long, complicated, lots of footnotes. What we do is help them create a plain English summary, which really describes the nature of the work. No pun intended. And then that means that if people want to go through and look at the journal article, they're able to, but it's really a way to unlock that. And when I was talking about, policymakers being briefed and that sort of stuff, this stuff is gold for them because they don't have to sort of wade through a big academic paper. They can just get the short and sweet version. Next one is really analysis of the news. And so the picture before with our newsroom, that's mostly what they're doing. They're saying, the environment and energy editor or the politics editor or the team in arts, they'll be pitching to the main editor or the chief of staff and saying, hey, I saw this, I heard this interview, I think we should do something on this. Or I saw on Twitter this happened, I think we should do something on that. And so they're really having a look at trying to find people who can explain things in a good way that we feel like there's a gap in terms of the coverage that other media are doing. So that's very fast turnaround. And the reason we can do that is because the software we've built is collaborative. It's a bit like a Google Doc where the academic and the author, so the academic author and the journalist, they work in the document at the same time. They can see each other's edits, they can communicate inside it, and there's lots of tools and tricks inside there to speed up the whole process. So it's not a sort of back and forth situation. So when sometimes people say, oh, I don't have time to write. Well, we say, oh, don't worry, I'll send you these four or five questions. Just, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? Oh, look, we've got the beginning of an article. What about this? Here's a headline, blah, blah. We can do it fast, which is where the skill comes in. So an example of the Christchurch attack, we did about 50 stories on that across our New Zealand and Australian team and internationally. And very useful, perhaps in the aftermath as well, making sense of something so senseless, and thinking about legislative control, gun control, responses, the media responses to it, a wide range of coverage there. And the third type is sort of ongoing series where we'll have a particular device or a sort of editorial product that will kind of go on for a long time. So Curious Kids is for kids aged sort of from 4 till 8 or older, but mainly that little group. And kids write in, we find an academic expert to answer the question. That was super popular. The ABC now have a podcast based on that called, forgotten? I've always wondered, no, something like that. And there's a book coming out called Curious Kids with a big publisher later in the year that they're doing for free under Creative Commons, but it's a nice way for us to sort of profile the work of those academics. Hidden Women of History was just one of the little things that is ongoing. One of our interns came up with that. We've got an intern program that we run a couple of times a year with about 10 or so interns over a sort of intensive month. And it was such a great idea that we kept building on that body of work. But we do things like Ask 5 Experts or Research Check or things that are sort of like editorial devices. And that means we can go to emerging or early career academics who won't necessarily be the superstars, but they can make a contribution about the work they're doing through some of these sort of simple editorial products. Which, again, anyone in the room can republish for free. Just use our guidelines. You don't need any permissions. It's all under Creative Commons. Just a little bit about the collaborative edifying. It's very important that you can only write in your area of expertise. So you can't get a geologist to write about some sort of gender thing. It's not just any old academic. You have to be, the research that you want to kind of reveal, it has to be your own area of expertise. So we also say the academic has final approval. So they have to sign off and say, yes, I'm happy with this edit, I'm happy with the headline, I'm happy with all that. So it gives, back to the Peter Doherty example, it gives them a great sense of control because they know exactly what happens before it goes live, which is good. They also have to disclose any funding that might be perceived by anyone on that particular article. Not just once when they first register, but every time they write, they have to say who funds them, would there be any perceived conflict by anyone? And that's important because often if you're reading the newspaper, you'd be amazed what's happening behind the scenes. If anyone's working PR, that's what PR is. It's trying to get stuff in the newspaper to sell products. And so if someone's got any disclosures, we insist upon those. There's a readability index based on the Fleisch-Kincaid readability index, an algorithm, which is it was actually just a free piece of open access code. It was sort of nothing, and it was just sort of popped in there at the last minute, but it's turned out to be one of those great things that everyone loves. A traffic light system means that you have to get green before you can go live, and you have to get a score of 100. It just measures sentence length and number of words in a sentence and gives you a little score. It's as simple as that. But that's nice because it allows the academic to go and allows the editor not to sort of make it personal. You can say, well, the machine says, so that works pretty well. We get a lot of, we send out every morning after our news conference, we send something out to the people who are in the media teams at universities, and they get access to a list of all the stuff that's coming out. And they can then help us find the right expert that's available that same day or that same morning. That's for the fast turnaround pieces. And then we get pitches from academics. When we started, we used to sort of say, write for us. And now I think the volume is so high because the audience is so massive, we only are able to sort of deal with about 10% of the pitches. So we get hundreds of those a week. We've published about 13,000 scholars since we started. There's only about 50,000 in Australia, so it's a big chunk of the research community. 16% get contacted for research collaboration. There's people who are invited to speak at conferences. Business is a big driver. And the most sort of dynamic one, I guess, is other media follow them up. Because you create a profile when you register, and we've got a little contact feature. You can basically go on and contact that academic. They get a nice formatted thing from the conversation saying, hey, a reader wants to contact you. And then it's up to the academic to decide to engage with that or not. But for media, mostly it's sort of a lot of radio, a lot of newspapers, lots of sort of web-based stuff as well. So, and look, usually the response is really welcomed by the academic because they've put themselves out there to engage, and they're active. They're ready for calls. Mostly, almost every article gets republished, and often media for an article that does very well, it can go on for quite a few days and generate many, many more thousands of reads. Just a couple of other things I wanted to sort of cover before we might go to some questions is just a bit about the business model. So in the intro, I was like, well, okay, no advertising and no marketing spend. That is broadly true. We just went through the Facebook Accelerator program that they're running for media globally, which was quite interesting. It's through the Walkley Foundation. So we're going to do a little bit of Facebook advertising for the very first time, but we're not doing any tracking. And so we're pitching that out to some agencies at the moment. We tell them what we want. We want 30,000 new newsletter subscribers in the next sort of X amount of months. And they're all like, yep, but no tracking. And they're like, that can't be done. So that's interesting. But I think there's a growing movement that we need to be somewhat cautious. All other media brands do it. All of our competitors do it. We're not going to do it. So we try to be as light touch as we can in terms of our web citizenry. So it costs about $4 million to run the Australian operation. It costs about 1.5 to run the technology piece through the centralised function. Of that sort of 4 million, we get about 2.3 from universities who pay an annual fee. And then the rest really comes from philanthropy of various sorts. So last year we had 10,500 individual readers who gave some sort of donation. Maybe it's $5 a month, $30 a month. Sometimes it's larger amounts. It's all tax deductible. And it's a really, I guess in some ways we're taking a bit of a leaf from the way that The Guardian have done it, which is to say there's no paywall, it's free, but if you can afford it and it's giving you any benefit, pay it, because we absolutely need it. It keeps it, I quite like this model in many ways because it keeps you very honest. You know that if you ask people and explain the model and you don't get it, then it's not worth it, or your ask hasn't been sort of persuasive enough. And in the same way, philanthropy for these sorts of projects in the States is quite good. We've had about 14 big foundations, many, many millions to fund that entity and that project. In Australia, we've had government support in the past, which has been really welcome. And we've got 3 foundations that we're working with at the moment, but there's not a whole lot of them that have funded journalism. More and more of them, it's becoming a problem. It's accelerating. The speed at which mainstream media is under threat is probably accelerating. So I think there'll probably be more philanthropy in the long run for non-profit media and public interest journalism. And I think people, from a reader's point of view, are sort of realising, if you want it, just like a lot of services, you're probably going to have to pay for it one way or another, either through taxes or through a direct contribution or wrapped up in some other subscription. So that's important. So any readers who feel inclined at the end of your tax year, we have a big campaign from May to June where we go crazy on the site, a bit like Wikipedia. It will really go, or it all just goes to the editors and to the technology. We don't spend it on anything crazy. It's just core business. And it is, it's an important one. So just to conclude, I just wanted to say, if you are interested in this sort of stuff and you haven't already, the best way to do it, to get out of the sort of filter of your social feed, is just to subscribe to the daily email, because we publish every morning just a full list of all the stories for the last 24 hours. And it's a quick scan, but it's a nice way to kind of get a list of everything. There's bound to be 1 or 2 things that will strike your interest most days, and that's probably the coolest way to kind of get access to it. Otherwise you end up just seeing the doctor stuff or just seeing the marketing stuff through the other platforms. So.